My wife wouldn't last a month without me, Richard said to his golf buddies while they laughed over bourbon in our backyard. She still calls me when the Wi-Fi goes down. Everyone at the patio table burst into laughter. I stood behind the sliding glass door holding a tray of lemonade, listening to the sound of my own humiliation echo across the yard like it was part of the evening entertainment. I didn't walk outside. I just stood there quietly in my pale blue cardigan, staring at the condensation dripping down the pitcher onto my hands. After 42 years of marriage, I suddenly realized something terrible. My husband did not see me as his partner. He saw me as proof of his importance. I'm Evelyn Carter. I'm 67 years old, and until that summer evening in Connecticut, I believed my marriage was solid. Not perfect, of course. No marriage survives 4 decades without scars. But I thought loyalty still meant something. I thought raising children together, surviving layoffs, burying parents, paying mortgages, and nursing each other through surgeries created a kind of respect that couldn't disappear. I was wrong. Richard had always enjoyed being admired. Even at 70, he carried himself like the captain of every room he entered. He liked expensive watches, loud opinions, and stories where he was always the smartest man involved. His friends loved him because he made them feel successful just by standing next to them. For years, I mistook his confidence for strength. Somewhere along the way, confidence turned into condescension, and I became too invisible to notice when it happened. "You okay in there, Evie?" one of his friends shouted through the screen door. "Richard says you'd probably starve without him." More laughter. I smiled automatically even though nobody could really see me. That was the thing about women my age. We learn how to smile through almost anything. Through funerals. Through loneliness. Through disappointment so deep it settles into your bones. I carried the tray back into the kitchen instead of going outside. The sound of laughter followed me through the house while I placed the glasses carefully onto the marble counter one by one. The kitchen smelled like grilled steak and rosemary potatoes. I had spent all afternoon preparing dinner for 12 people, who would probably never remember I cooked it. The sunlight coming through the windows hit the framed family photos beside the refrigerator. Daniel at his college graduation. Our wedding picture from 1982. Richard smiling beside the sailboat he bought after his retirement bonus. In every photograph, I was standing slightly behind him. I suddenly wondered if I had been standing behind him my entire life. Richard came inside 20 minutes later carrying his empty whiskey glass. "Hey," he said casually, opening the refrigerator. "Did you hear us joking around out there?" I kept wiping the counter with a dish towel even though it was already spotless. "I heard." "Oh, come on." He chuckled. "Don't be sensitive." The guys were laughing. I looked at him then. Really looked at him. His silver hair. His pressed polo shirt. The comfortable confidence of a man who had never doubted his place in the world. "Why would that be funny?" I asked quietly. He blinked at me like the question itself was strange. "Because it's true, Evelyn." He said it so casually. So naturally. Like commenting on the weather. He grabbed another ice cube from the freezer and dropped it into his glass. "You've never handled bills, investments, any of that stuff. You hate stress. That's why you have me. That's why you have me. Not love. Not partnership. Ownership disguised as protection." I felt something shift inside me right then, small but permanent, like the first crack appearing in ice before the whole lake gives way. Richard walked back outside without noticing the silence he left behind him. I stood alone in the kitchen listening to the screen door slam shut. Then I looked down at my hands. The same hands that raised our son, packed Richard's lunches for 30 years, cared for his mother during chemo treatments, balanced grocery budgets during recessions, and stayed awake night after night when he had pneumonia at 53. Suddenly those hands did not look weak to me anymore. They looked capable. And for the first time in years, I found myself wondering what my life might look like if I stopped living as someone else's supporting character. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise the way I always did. For years, my mornings had followed the same quiet rhythm. Coffee at 6. Water the hydrangeas by the front porch. Pack Richard's lunch if he had an early golf game or a meeting downtown. Some habits become so automatic you stop noticing them, like breathing or locking the front door. But that morning felt different. The house felt different. I stood in the kitchen wearing my old grey robe, while the coffee maker gurgled softly in the silence. Richard was still asleep upstairs. Through the window above the sink, I could see a thin layer of fog hanging over our backyard. The patio chairs from the barbecue sat scattered around the stone fire pit exactly where everyone had left them the night before. Empty beer bottles. Folded napkins. Half-melted ice in a cooler. Evidence of an evening I suddenly wished I could erase. I wrapped both hands around my coffee mug and tried to understand why his words still echoed so loudly inside me. It was not only what Richard said. It was how easily he said it. As if my entire existence could be summarized as dependence. As if 42 years of sacrifice had somehow erased my intelligence, my strength, and every quiet thing I had carried for this family. Upstairs, I heard the shower turn on. Richard would come downstairs soon expecting eggs, toast, and his vitamins lined neatly beside the newspaper. For the first time in decades, I did not move. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the small notebook near the fruit bowl. It was an old spiral notebook filled with grocery lists, appointment reminders, and holiday recipes written in my mother's handwriting. My fingers traced the faded ink on the cover. Homemade peach pie. Cinnamon apple bread. Blueberry cobbler. My mother used to sell pies from her kitchen window in Vermont when I was little. During the summers, I would help her roll dough while she hummed old Patsy Cline songs by the radio. Women survive by learning how to make something out of almost nothing, she once told me while flour covered both our hands. I had not thought about those words in years. Richard came downstairs wearing khaki shorts and a navy polo shirt. "Morning," he said casually, grabbing the sports section from the counter. "Did you already feed Baxter?" I looked toward the living room, where our golden retriever lay sleeping near the fireplace. "Not yet." Richard glanced up from his paper, surprised. "Everything okay?" "I am tired," I answered simply. He nodded distractedly, already reading headlines about the stock market. "Well, do not forget we are meeting Daniel and Vanessa for dinner tonight. 6:30 at Marlowe's." Vanessa always chose expensive restaurants with dim lighting and tiny portions that left everyone pretending they were full afterward. Richard liked her because she admired successful men. Daniel liked her because she made every decision for him. I used to think that confidence was sophistication. Now it just looked exhausting. After Richard left for the golf course, the house became still again. I walked slowly through each room noticing things I had ignored for years. Richard's framed business awards covered the office walls downstairs. Family vacations were displayed like achievements. In almost every photo, I stood smiling beside everyone else while carrying beach bags, folding chairs, snacks, sunscreen, or jackets. I was always holding something. Taking care of something. Making everyone comfortable. But nobody had asked me in a very long time whether I was happy. Around noon, I drove to the grocery store. The cashier, a young woman with pink fingernails, smiled politely while scanning my items. Eggs. Butter. Fresh peaches. Heavy cream. Big baking day? She asked lightly. I looked down at the ingredients sitting in the cart. For a second, I almost said no. Almost laughed it off the way I usually dismissed my own ideas before anyone else could. But something stopped me. Maybe, I said quietly. The word felt unfamiliar in my mouth. Maybe. When I got home, sunlight filled the kitchen in soft golden stripes across the countertops. I tied on my old floral apron and opened my mother's notebook carefully to the peach pie recipe. Outside, the wind moved gently through the maple trees lining our backyard. Inside, butter melted beneath my fingertips while flour dusted the counter like fresh snow. And for the first time in years, I was not cooking for Richard. I was not cooking for guests. I was not cooking because it was expected of me. I was creating something simply because I wanted to. Marlowe's was crowded by the time Richard and I arrived that evening. The restaurant sat along the riverfront in downtown Hartford, all dark wood, hanging lights, and waiters carrying tiny plates decorated like museum pieces. Vanessa loved places like that because they made ordinary conversations sound important. She was already seated when we arrived, wearing a cream blazer that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Daniel stood when he saw us, leaning down to kiss my cheek quickly before checking his phone again. "Mom," he said distractedly. "You look nice." I had spent 20 minutes deciding whether to wear pearls or not. In the end, I left them home, because lately expensive jewelry on older women only seemed to invite comments about inheritance. Traffic was terrible, Richard announced as he loosened his jacket and sat beside Daniel. This city gets worse every year. Vanessa smiled at him immediately. Richard, you still made better time than anyone else would have. I watched the exchange quietly while unfolding my napkin across my lap. Vanessa had a talent for making men feel impressive. It was one of the reasons she moved through life so easily. The waiter arrived with sparkling water and menus, but Richard barely glanced at his before ordering the steak special and an $18 bourbon. Daniel copied him automatically. Some habits pass from father to son without either man noticing. So, Vanessa said brightly, turning toward me, Richard told us you spent all day baking yesterday. Her smile widened slightly. That sounds adorable. Adorable. The same word people use for toddlers drawing crooked pictures with crayons. I reached for my water glass calmly. I made peach pies. For who? Daniel asked. Nobody, I answered. I just felt like baking. Richard chuckled beside him. Your mother suddenly thinks she is running a country bakery. Now? Daniel laughed softly. Vanessa tilted her head sympathetically. Honestly, Evelyn, I think hobbies are wonderful at your age. It is important to stay mentally active. At your age. I stared down at the candle flickering between us. There it was again. The quiet dismissal hidden inside polite language. The assumption that my life had already narrowed into harmless little activities designed to keep me occupied while the important people handled the real world. A younger version of me would have laughed politely to keep dinner pleasant. That woman had spent decades smoothing over uncomfortable moments before they could become conflict. But lately I was starting to notice how often comfort required my silence. Did you know, Vanessa continued while scanning the wine list, there is actually a little baking club near Westport for retirees. My friend signed her mother up after she stopped working. They do holiday cupcakes and things like that. Richard smiled into his bourbon glass. See? Perfect for you. Something cold settled quietly in my chest then. Not anger exactly. Clarity. They truly believed I had become small. Not because I lacked intelligence or ability, but because they had grown comfortable seeing me only through the narrow role I played in their lives. Wife. Mother. Hostess. Background noise. The waiter brought our appetizers while conversations drifted toward golf memberships, property taxes, and a luxury condo development Daniel wanted to invest in. Nobody asked my opinion. Nobody noticed I had stopped speaking entirely. Halfway through dinner, Vanessa pulled out her phone to show Richard pictures from a charity luncheon she attended in Greenwich. This woman started a skincare company at 35 and sold it for $8 million, she said admiringly. Can you imagine building something like that? Richard shook his head with a laugh. It takes a certain kind of person. His eyes moved briefly toward me before returning to the photos. Business is not for everyone. The words landed softly. Almost casually. But I felt them all the same. I looked around the restaurant then. At the women in tailored suits discussing contracts over wine. At the exhausted waitress balancing heavy trays across the dining room. At the young hostess managing reservations with a calm smile while customers complained near the front desk. Every woman in that room was doing something. Building something. Carrying something. And suddenly I could not remember why I had accepted the idea that my usefulness expired the moment my hair turned grey. On the drive home, Richard talked about interest rates while soft jazz played through the speakers. I barely heard him. Outside the passenger window, the Connecticut streets blurred beneath the glow of streetlights and storefronts closing for the night. My reflection stared back at me in the glass. Tired eyes. Silver hair. Fine lines around my mouth from years of polite smiling. But beneath all of that, something else had started to appear. Not youth. Not bitterness. Resolve. Quiet and steady. Like dew rising slowly in the dark before dawn. 3 days later, I found myself standing inside a small coffee shop called Maple and Pine on the edge of West Hartford with 2 peach pies balanced carefully in my arms. The morning air smelled like rain and freshly cut grass, and for at least 10 minutes I sat in my car staring at the storefront window wondering if I should just drive home. It suddenly felt ridiculous. A 67-year-old woman carrying pies into a cafe like some desperate housewife trying to feel useful. I almost laughed at myself. Then I remembered Richard's voice at the restaurant. Business is not for everyone. Something inside me hardened quietly. The bell above the cafe door chimed softly when I stepped inside. The place was warm and narrow, filled with mismatched wooden tables and the smell of espresso beans. A young barista with purple streaks in her hair smiled politely before hurrying to finish an order. Behind the counter stood a woman around my age wearing jeans, white sneakers, and a denim shirt rolled at the sleeves. Her silver curls were tied loosely at the back of her neck. She looked tired in the way hard-working women often do. "Can I help you?" she asked kindly. I tightened my grip on the pie carrier. "My name is Evelyn Carter," I said carefully. "I was wondering if you ever buy homemade desserts from local bakers." The woman wiped her hands on a towel and walked closer. "Depends," she answered honestly. "What did you bring?" I opened the carrier slowly. The smell of cinnamon and baked peaches drifted between us immediately. For a second, neither of us spoke. "Well," she murmured softly, "that smells like somebody's childhood." I could not remember the last time anyone had spoken about something I made with genuine interest. "My mother's recipe," I said quietly. "I have been baking it since I was 19. The woman smiled. "I am Margaret." She reached for a knife behind the counter. "Mind if I try it?" I shook my head. My pulse was beating embarrassingly fast while she sliced into the pie. The crust cracked softly beneath the knife, golden and flaky. Margaret took one bite, then another. Finally she looked up at me with an expression I had not seen directed toward me in years. "Respect." "Evelyn," she said carefully, "people would absolutely pay money for this." I felt heat rise unexpectedly behind my eyes. Not because of the compliment itself, but because I realized how hungry I had become for someone to see value in me beyond keeping a clean house and remembering birthdays. Margaret asked me questions for nearly 20 minutes. How long had I baked? Did I make other desserts? Had I ever sold professionally before? I answered honestly. No. Never. Richard always handled finances. Richard always handled business. Saying the words aloud suddenly sounded strange even to me. Before I left, Margaret handed me a paper business card with a coffee stain near the corner. Bring me 4 pies Saturday morning, she said. If customers like them, we will go from there. 4 pies. I nodded calmly even though my heart was racing like a teenager's. Outside, the sky had turned pale grey, and light rain tapped gently against my windshield as I sat inside my car holding the business card with both hands. 4 pies. Such a small thing. Yet it felt enormous. On the drive home, I stopped at the grocery store and bought extra butter, flour, peaches, and brown sugar. The cashier glanced at my overflowing cart. Busy weekend, she asked. I think so, I replied softly. Back home, Richard was in his office yelling into a speakerphone about investment accounts. He barely looked up when I carried groceries inside. You spent $180, he asked absently while reviewing paperwork. Baking ingredients, I answered. He sighed dramatically. Evelyn, this is exactly what I mean. You get excited about little hobbies and suddenly we are spending money like teenagers. Little hobbies. I placed the grocery bags quietly onto the kitchen counter. Then I looked toward the office doorway, where Richard sat surrounded by framed certificates and polished wood shelves filled with books he rarely opened anymore. For the first time in years, his confidence no longer intimidated me. It just looked loud. I will pay for it myself, I said calmly. Richard frowned slightly above his reading glasses. With what money? The question hung between us for a second too long. I surprised myself by smiling. Not bitterly. Not sadly. Just calmly. I guess we are about to find out. Saturday morning arrived cold and grey, with rain tapping softly against the kitchen windows before sunrise. I had been awake since 4:30, moving quietly through the house while Richard slept upstairs. The kitchen counters disappeared beneath bowls of sliced peaches, sticks of butter, measuring cups, and cooling racks lined with parchment paper. 4 years I cooked because people expected me to. Holiday dinners. Charity luncheons. Church potlucks. Endless meals that vanished in minutes without anyone noticing the hours behind them. But this felt different. Every pie cooling on the counter belonged to me. By 7:15, the entire house smelled like cinnamon and brown sugar. Baxter lay stretched across the floor near the oven, lifting his head every time I opened the door to rotate another pie. Outside, the maple trees swayed beneath the wind while headlights passed occasionally beyond our front yard. I moved carefully between counters, wiping flour from my hands onto the faded apron tied around my waist. For the first time in years, I felt focused instead of tired. Richard came downstairs around 8 o'clock wearing sweatpants and carrying his phone. He stopped halfway into the kitchen, staring at the rows of pies covering nearly every surface. Good Lord, he muttered. Are you feeding the whole neighborhood? I have an order, I answered calmly without looking up from the pie crust I was sealing. He leaned against the doorway with mild amusement. An order? The word sounded strange coming from him, like he was trying it on for size. From who? Maple and Pine Cafe. Richard gave a short laugh under his breath. Evelyn, honey, small coffee shops buy frozen desserts from restaurant suppliers. They are not building an empire around homemade peach pie. I slid another tray into the oven carefully before turning toward him. Maybe not. He shrugged casually. I just do not want you getting your hopes up over something temporary. Temporary. Another small word carrying a larger meaning beneath it. Richard had spent years speaking to me that way. Never openly cruel. Never loud enough for anyone else to notice. Just constant little reminders that my ambitions belonged in the category of hobbies rather than possibilities. He kissed the top of my head absent-mindedly before pouring himself coffee. Anyway, I am heading to the club later. Try not to wear yourself out playing baker all day. Playing baker. I watched him leave the kitchen while carrying his coffee mug upstairs, completely certain the world still worked exactly as it always had. Around 9:30, I loaded 4 peach pies carefully into cardboard boxes and drove through the drizzle toward Maple and Pine. My windshield wipers moved steadily while nerves twisted quietly inside my stomach. It suddenly occurred to me that Margaret might taste the pies again and decide they were not special after all. Maybe I had imagined the respect in her expression. Maybe I was embarrassing myself. I almost turned the car around twice. But when I walked into the cafe carrying the warm boxes, Margaret smiled immediately. There she is, she called from behind the counter. You have perfect timing. The cafe was busier than before. Students worked on laptops near the windows while couples sat drinking coffee beneath soft jazz playing. Overhead, Margaret opened one pie box right there beside the espresso machine. The smell drifted through the cafe almost instantly. A woman sitting nearby looked up from her latte. Oh my God, she said softly. That smells incredible. Margaret winked at me. Told you. Before noon, all 4 pies had sold out by the slice. I stood frozen near the register watching strangers eat something I created. A young father ordered 2 extra slices to take home to his wife. An elderly man closed his eyes after one bite and quietly said it reminded him of summers in Maine when he was a boy. Nobody called it adorable. Nobody treated it like a cute little retirement distraction. Margaret handed me an envelope before I left that afternoon. Inside was $320 in cash. I stared at the money silently while standing beside my car in the rain. My hands actually trembled a little. $320. It was not life-changing money. Richard probably spent that much during one golf weekend without noticing. But I had earned it myself. Not through marriage. Not through sacrifice. Not through supporting someone else's dream. Mine. When I got home, Richard was watching a financial news program in the living room. He barely glanced away from the television as I walked in. How did your little pie experiment go? He asked casually. I placed the envelope gently onto the coffee table in front of him. Richard frowned and opened it. His expression changed slightly when he saw the cash inside. What is this? Today's sales, I answered. The room went quiet except for the low voice of the television anchor discussing stock prices. Richard looked back at the envelope again, then at me. For the first time in a very long while, he did not seem entirely sure what to say. By the following Thursday, Maple and Pine had sold every dessert I brought in. Peach pies, apple crumble bars, lemon loaf cake, brown butter cookies with sea salt. Margaret started texting me before sunrise asking if I could make extra batches, because customers kept requesting the homemade desserts from Evelyn. The first time she sent that message, I stared at my phone for nearly a full minute. The homemade desserts from Evelyn. Not Richard's wife. Not Daniel's mother. Just Evelyn. I had forgotten how powerful it felt to hear my own name attached to something meaningful. The kitchen became my world again, but differently now. Not like before, when cooking felt invisible and expected. This time every cracked egg, every rolled crust, every warm tray leaving the oven carried purpose behind it. I found myself waking up excited instead of exhausted. My body still ached sometimes. My knees complained after standing too long. But there was a difference between being tired and being empty. 4 years, I had been both. Now I was only tired. One afternoon, Margaret invited me to sit with her during the lunch rush while we reviewed weekend orders. The cafe buzzed with conversation and steaming milk machines, while rain streaked softly down the windows outside. "You ever think about opening your own place?" she asked casually while scribbling inventory notes onto a clipboard. I laughed immediately. At my age. Margaret did not laugh back. Evelyn, Julia Child, became famous in her 50s. Vera Wang designed her first dress at 40. Half the world starts over eventually. I looked down at my coffee cup quietly. Start over. The phrase sounded dangerous and thrilling at the same time. When I arrived home later that evening, Richard was already in the kitchen pouring himself bourbon. "You are late," he said without looking up. "The cafe was busy. You are spending an awful lot of time there lately." His tone remained casual, but I noticed something underneath it now. Irritation. Not because I was neglecting him. Because my attention no longer revolved entirely around him. I placed grocery bags onto the counter while removing my coat. "It is work." Richard leaned back against the island slowly. "Let us not get carried away calling it work." There it was again. That soft dismissive tone, polished smooth after decades of practice. "It is baking, Evelyn. You are not exactly running a corporation." I unpacked butter and heavy cream quietly before answering. "Nobody said I was." Richard took a sip of bourbon. "I just do not want you embarrassing yourself chasing some fantasy business at this stage of life." Fantasy business. I turned toward him then, holding a carton of eggs in my hands. "Do you know what is interesting?" I asked calmly. He frowned slightly. "What?" "You spent years telling everyone I could not survive without you." Richard stared at me silently. I continued carefully. "But the second I try building something for myself, you suddenly seem uncomfortable." His jaw tightened almost invisibly. "That is not what this is about." "Then what is it about?" The room went still between us. Outside, headlights swept briefly across the front windows as cars passed through the neighborhood. Richard set his glass down harder than necessary. "You are overreacting. I was joking the other night with the guys." "Maybe." I folded the grocery bag carefully into a neat square. "But jokes usually contain some truth." Richard opened his mouth to argue, then stopped. For the first time in our marriage, he looked uncertain around me. Not angry. Unsteady. Like the script he relied on no longer worked properly. Upstairs, my phone buzzed against the counter. Margaret had sent a photo of customers lined up near the pastry case beneath a handwritten sign reading, "Fresh Desserts by Evelyn Carter." I stared at the image quietly while warmth spread slowly through my chest. Richard noticed my expression immediately. "What now?" he asked. I turned the phone toward him. He studied the picture for a second too long before forcing a shrug. "Small towns get excited over homemade pies. It does not mean anything." But his voice sounded thinner now. Less certain. I slipped the phone back into my pocket gently. "Maybe not," I answered softly. Then I carried the groceries upstairs, while Richard remained alone in the kitchen beside his untouched bourbon. Halfway up the staircase, I realized something surprising. I was no longer afraid of disappointing him. And once that fear disappeared, a great many other things began disappearing with it. By October, my desserts had become the best-selling items at Maple and Pine. Margaret started calling me before dawn to discuss inventory because customers were arriving early asking whether the peach lady had delivered yet. The cafe added my name to their chalkboard menu near the register. Fresh cinnamon rolls by Evelyn Carter. Homemade apple pie by Evelyn Carter. People I had never met suddenly knew who I was. Not because of Richard. Not because of Daniel. Because of something I built with my own hands. The strangest part was how quickly my confidence returned once someone stopped treating me like a decorative object. I began reading business articles online late at night while Richard slept beside me. I learned about food permits, local vendor licenses, small business taxes, and commercial kitchen rentals. Some mornings I drove 30 minutes to a shared kitchen facility in Hartford where independent bakers rented workspace by the hour. The first time I walked inside, I felt intimidated by the stainless steel counters and industrial ovens larger than my refrigerator at home. Most of the people there were younger than me. Tattooed pastry chefs. Couples launching food trucks. Women balancing spreadsheets beside trays of cupcakes. But nobody looked at me with pity. Nobody spoke to me like I was fragile. They simply treated me like another person trying to build something. One afternoon, while packaging cranberry muffins for the cafe, a young woman named Tessa glanced at me over her mixing bowl. "Your peach pies are all over social media," she said casually. "Some food blogger from New Haven posted about them last week." I laughed because I assumed she was exaggerating. Then she showed me the post on her phone. There it was. A photograph of my pie beside a latte beneath the words, "The best homemade dessert in Connecticut might be hiding in a tiny cafe outside Hartford." Thousands of people had liked it. Hundreds commented asking where to buy one. I stared at the screen feeling strangely disconnected from my own life. Somewhere between 60 and 67, I had quietly accepted the idea that nothing new would ever happen to me again. No reinvention. No discovery. No beginning. Only maintenance. Then suddenly the world opened a small door I did not even realize still existed. Richard noticed the changes before I said anything aloud. He noticed I no longer rushed home immediately after deliveries. He noticed I stopped asking permission before spending money on ingredients. He noticed I started wearing lipstick again, even on ordinary Tuesdays. One evening, he sat across from me at dinner while absently scrolling through financial news on his tablet. "You have been gone a lot lately," he said without looking up. "The kitchen rental is in Hartford," I replied calmly. "Traffic takes time." He continued reading silently for another moment before speaking again. "You are making this bakery thing your entire personality." I cut into my salmon carefully. "It is called having work." Richard lowered the tablet slowly. "You know what I mean." His voice remained controlled, but frustration sat just beneath it now. "Ever since this started, you act different." I looked at him across the candlelit dining room. "Different how?" He hesitated. "Distant." The word almost made me smile. For decades I had centered my entire existence around his comfort, his schedule, his career, his moods. Now that I spent a few hours building something for myself, suddenly I was distant. "I am busy," I answered simply. Richard leaned back in his chair. "You are 67 years old, Evelyn. Most people your age are slowing down, traveling, enjoying retirement. You are running around like you need to prove something." I set my fork down quietly. "Maybe I do." Silence settled heavily across the table. In the living room, Baxter snored softly beside the fireplace while rain tapped against the windows. Richard studied me carefully then, as if searching for the woman he thought he understood. "You know," he said slowly, "there was a time you were happy just taking care of this family." Just taking care of this family. The sentence landed gently, but I finally heard the deeper meaning beneath it. He missed the version of me that stayed small enough to fit comfortably inside his life. I folded my napkin onto the table and stood up calmly. "Richard," I said softly, "taking care of everyone else was never the problem." He frowned slightly. "Then what was?" I looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Nobody ever asked what it was costing me." Then I carried my plate to the kitchen while Richard remained alone at the table, staring down at his untouched glass of bourbon. The invitation arrived in early November, on thick cream-colored paper embossed with gold lettering. Daniel and Vanessa were hosting an anniversary dinner at the Hartford Country Club for close friends and family. Richard placed the envelope beside my coffee cup one morning while adjusting his cufflinks before a meeting. "You are still coming, right?" he asked casually. Vanessa already reserved seats. I looked down at the invitation for a long moment. In previous years, I would have spent weeks planning what to wear, what gift to bring, what dessert to contribute if Vanessa allowed it. But now the thought of sitting through another evening of polished conversations and subtle humiliations exhausted me. "I have work Saturday night," I answered. Richard stopped halfway toward the hallway. "Work?" He repeated the word carefully, almost like he still found it strange attached to me. "You cannot skip your son's dinner because of pies." I folded the invitation closed. "It is a holiday catering order. 42 dessert boxes." Richard stared at me for a second before laughing softly under his breath. "You are unbelievable lately." I did not argue. There was no point anymore. Richard still believed my business existed somewhere between a hobby and a temporary emotional phase. He could not understand that every order pulled me further away from the woman who once waited quietly for scraps of validation at dinner tables. Saturday arrived cold and bright, with frost coating the edges of our lawn before sunrise. By 6 in the morning, I was already inside the commercial kitchen in Hartford, surrounded by trays of cranberry orange scones, maple pecan bars, and cinnamon loaf cakes cooling beneath fluorescent lights. Christmas music played softly through an old radio near the sink while steam clouded the windows from industrial ovens running non-stop. Tessa worked beside me packaging dessert boxes with gold ribbon while laughing about some disastrous online date from the night before. For hours, I forgot entirely about the country club dinner happening across town. I forgot about Vanessa's perfect dresses and Richard's carefully rehearsed stories about retirement investments. Inside that kitchen, nobody treated me like I had aged out of relevance. Around 7:30 that evening, my phone buzzed repeatedly across the stainless steel counter. "Richard." I almost ignored it. Almost. But something in me still reacted automatically after 42 years. I wiped flour from my hands and answered. Loud music and conversation spilled through the speaker immediately. "Where are you?" Richard asked sharply. "Still working. Daniel keeps asking why you did not come." His irritation sounded stronger than concern. "You embarrassed us tonight, Evelyn." I leaned against the counter quietly while workers moved around me carrying trays and boxes. "I told you I had an order. For God's sake, it is dessert, not brain surgery." I closed my eyes briefly. There it was again. That inability to imagine anything I did carrying real value. Before I could answer, another voice suddenly came through the phone. "Vanessa." "Richard, ask her if she can still make those little lemon squares for Thanksgiving." I heard laughter nearby. Everyone loved them last year. Something shifted inside me then. Calmly. Permanently. I realized they still saw my work only in terms of what it provided for them. Dessert trays. Decorations. Comfort. Support. Service. Never ambition. Never identity. Just usefulness. "No," I said quietly. The line went silent. Richard sounded confused. What do you mean no? I mean I will not be making desserts for Thanksgiving this year. More silence. Then Vanessa laughed awkwardly somewhere in the background. Oh come on, Evelyn. Do not be dramatic. Dramatic. The word women hear whenever they stop making life easier for everyone else. I looked around the kitchen then. At the women balancing invoices beside cooling racks. At Tessa dancing badly while boxing muffins. At my own reflection in the darkened window above the prep sink. Flour on my apron. Tired eyes. Purpose. I am not being dramatic, I answered calmly. I am just busy building my own life. Richard exhaled heavily into the phone. Ever since this business started, you act like we are the enemy. I almost smiled at that. Because for the first time, I finally understood something important. The people who benefit most from your silence rarely know how to handle your independence. I have to go, I said softly. The orders are leaving soon. Before Richard could answer, I ended the call and placed the phone face down beside the mixing bowls. For several seconds, I simply stood there listening to the ovens hum around me. Then Tessa walked over holding a bakery box tied with red ribbon. Everything okay? She asked gently. I looked at the rows of desserts waiting to be delivered across Connecticut by morning. Hundreds of boxes carrying my recipes, my work, my name. And for the first time in decades, the answer came easily. Actually, I said quietly, I think it finally is. By spring, people were driving from 3 different counties to buy desserts with my name on the label. Maple and Pine had expanded into catering corporate lunches and private events, and Margaret finally sat me down one quiet Tuesday morning before opening hours with a stack of paperwork and a look I recognized immediately. Serious women wear that expression right before changing their lives. I found a place, she said simply, sliding a brochure across the table toward me. It was a small storefront near the riverfront in Hartford. Brick walls. Tall front windows. A tiny outdoor patio with iron tables. The previous bakery had closed after the owner retired to Florida. I stared at the photographs silently while my coffee cooled untouched beside me. Margaret, I said carefully, I cannot open a bakery. She folded her arms across the counter. Why not? The answer rose automatically to my lips. Because I am too old. Because I have never run a business. Because Richard would think it was ridiculous. But none of those reasons sounded convincing anymore. Margaret must have seen the hesitation moving across my face, because she leaned closer and lowered her voice. Evelyn, you spent 40 years building everybody else's life. You are allowed to build one for yourself now. That night, I drove alone to look at the storefront after sunset. The for-lease sign hung crooked in the window, while streetlights reflected softly against the glass. I stood on the sidewalk with my coat wrapped tightly around me, staring at the empty space inside. Dust covered the counters. Chairs sat stacked upside down against the walls. Yet somehow I could already imagine the smell of cinnamon drifting through the room. I could picture warm lights glowing through the windows on snowy mornings while customers carried coffee cups between their hands. For the first time in decades, my future felt larger than routine. When I got home, Richard was sitting alone in the living room watching financial news with the volume too loud. He muted the television as soon as I walked in. We need to talk, he said immediately. His voice sounded tired lately. Older somehow. I sat carefully across from him without removing my coat. Richard stared at his hands for a moment before speaking again. Daniel told me Vanessa is upset about Thanksgiving. I almost laughed softly. Months had passed, and somehow they were still offended I stopped volunteering endless unpaid labor wrapped in politeness. I am sorry she feels that way, I answered calmly. Richard exhaled slowly. Everything has changed between us. I looked around the room quietly. The same framed photographs. The same leather chairs. The same fireplace where I spent years decorating stockings and wrapping presents, while Richard handled conversations about business and investments with the men in our family. But he was right. Everything had changed. Mostly me. I looked at a storefront tonight, I said suddenly. Richard frowned. What? A bakery space in Hartford. Silence filled the room. You are serious, he said finally. Not a question. A realization. I nodded once. Richard leaned back slowly like the air had shifted around him. Evelyn, opening a business at this stage of life is risky. So is spending 40 years disappearing. The words came out softer than I expected. Richard looked down immediately. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he asked quietly, was I really that bad? I studied him carefully then. The man I married at 25. The father of my son. The man who once brought me soup during the flu and danced with me barefoot in the kitchen while Frank Sinatra played late at night. Richard was not evil. That would have been easier somehow. He was simply a man who grew comfortable being the center of someone else's sacrifice. You stopped seeing me, I answered honestly. His face tightened slightly. I thought I was taking care of you. I know. Tears did not come. Anger did not come either. Only clarity. But somewhere along the way, taking care of me became controlling who I was allowed to become. Richard looked toward the dark television screen without speaking. For the first time since I had known him, he looked small. Not weak. Human. I stood up slowly and walked toward the staircase before stopping halfway across the room. I signed the lease this afternoon, I said quietly. Richard lifted his eyes toward me. What are you calling it? A small smile touched my mouth before I could stop it. Evelyn's table. Outside, spring rain tapped gently against the windows while the house settled into silence around us. And standing there in that quiet living room at 67 years old, I realized something I wished I had understood much earlier. A woman does not become powerful when the world finally notices her. She becomes powerful the moment she no longer needs permission to exist as herself.